This is Law with Charlie, hosted by Charlie Medcalf. This is your podcast and YouTube channel for all things law, legal academia, and qualifying as a barrister.
Hello and welcome to this next podcast episode with me, Charlie Medcalf. And in this episode I'm going to be continuing my introductions for my podcast revision lecture series. And in today's episode I'm going to be introducing you to the topic of medical law. And so, as I said last week in my employment law introduction podcast, these podcasts are very much for revision purposes, so you can do some of the more mundane chores which you may have in life, such as laundry, cooking, washing up, or whatnot. And then you can listen to these podcasts at the same time, so you can do some kind of revision and get the content in your head. That's something I particularly like doing, and I also like doing that when I'm walking or just anything like that, really. So yes, I've found a gap in terms of the law in these areas, and so I hope you will find these podcasts as useful as I am going to find them, because I will be using them as well, as if I wasn't the creator. And then also, just before we go further into this podcast, if you haven't already, check out my YouTube channel, Law with Charlie, because many of these podcasts are related to the actual lectures I've delivered on the various areas of the topics I'm covering, and so they are much more in depth and they provide much more, whereas these podcasts are much more revision purposes. But let's get straight into what this this podcast series is going to entail, and what can you expect to hear from the medical law podcast on the Law with Charlie podcast and YouTube channel. And so firstly, there's going to be the topic of medical negligence, and this is very much related to the law of tort, which you may have already covered as part of the foundations of legal knowledge, which are required for a qualifying law degree. And in this area, we will look at the duty and standard of care in a medical setting, breach of that duty in a medical setting, as well as both legal and factual causation. And so in this area, for instance, we'll be looking quite heavily on Bolam and Bolifo, which are two of the most important cases for medical law. And then once we've done that topic, we then move away from familiar content, i.e. content you may have already come across during your law degree, and we move into new territory, which is really, really exciting. And we begin this new territory with informed consent, where we will look at what informed consent actually is, when can we consent or when can we not consent, but also what makes an informed consent valid and what makes an informed consent invalid. Or in other words, when is a consent not informed? How much information do the doctors actually need to give to the patients? And this is where the law around Montgomery in particular can come in as well and be useful for us. Then we will be spending the next few next few topics, really building on our knowledge of consent and the various aspects to the topic of consent. Because in order to consent, you need to have capacity, competence, autonomy, and all of that stuff. And so we will then go on to the third topic, which is very much consent in older children and teenagers. So this is those children who are, it's difficult to say, probably 12 upwards is a reasonable age, but essentially those children between early teens to 18, because when you're 18 in England and Wales under the law, you are a legal adult, and so you then have the full rights of an adult. But below 18, you're a bit more limited. But the law does allow provisions for teenagers and older children to provide consent. So based on the law, when a adolescent becomes 16, they can then consent to medical treatment, but their consent can be overridden by either their parents or guardians, or even the court in exceptional cases. And so at that age, those under 18 do not have absolute capacity to consent. However, that's only for individuals who are over 16. For individuals under 16, it may still be possible for them to consent to medical treatment, but it has also been seen that this law, in particular, applies to other areas of the law as well, and that is essentially the idea of Gillick competence, the idea that if you have sufficient understanding of the procedure, then you may have Gillick competence, which allows you to consent to treatment before you're 16. And yeah, the whole idea of Gillick competence is a very important foundational piece of knowledge in anything to do with children's law, I would say. But then moving on from that, we then step away from under 18s for a bit, just slightly, and look at consent again from a wider angle, wider perspective, by looking at the Mental Capacity Act. And so here we'll be looking at how the law defines mental capacity, what happens if someone's found to lack mental capacity, and this can include children. There will be some examples such as eating disorders, which is a particularly interesting area of the law on mental capacity. And then we also look at advanced decisions and the validity of them, as well as the law around lasting powers of attorney, and again, the validity of lasting powers of attorney, or LPAs. And that's essentially when an LPA is essentially when someone can make a decision on your behalf, and so that's a very interesting area of law as well. After topic 4, though, we then move on to topic 5, where we will be looking at consent in babies and young children. So, how does the law regulate this? Obviously, babies and young children cannot provide consent themselves. More often than not, they can't even talk. Well, babies can't, and they may not even understand the different procedures. And so usually it's the parents, those with parental responsibility, who can often consent for their children. And in many, many cases, this will be okay, that they will be allowed to consent for their children to have or not have medical treatment. However, there's going to be cases where actually either the parents want their child to have treatment but the doctors disagree, or the doctors want their child to have treatment but the parents disagree. And this can become a very controversial area of the law, because this is where often these kinds of cases get to the courts, Court of Appeal, High Court, in the very exceptional cases the Supreme Court, where it's then in the court's hands to make a decision, and usually they will rule in favour of whatever the doctors are saying, which in my academic legal opinion is completely wrong, and there's too much deference towards the medical profession. And so this is an area of law where I think it's taken the wrong approach, especially when there's been times when we can see that the medical profession have essentially got it wrong. But that's going to be a really interesting topic to talk about when we get there. But then following that, we then move on to the topic of assisted reproduction, which is another rather interesting topic. And essentially, from this moment onwards now, the topics are just keep getting better and better in my opinion, and more interesting, and we now start entering the territory where ethical debates are very, very relevant. And so in the topic of assisted reproduction, we look at the types of assisted reproduction. So for instance, IVF, then Then there's also insemination, artificial insemination, egg donations, sperm donations, and surrogacy as well, to name a few. Surrogacy being a particularly big topic in both medical law and family law, and the Law Commission have published a report with suggestions for change as well, and so that will be something which we will discuss in this area, as well as considering the various ethical debates around assisted reproduction. So for instance, cloning. Human cloning, or any cloning really, is scientifically possible. We are able to create a clone of someone. But let's have a bit of an ethical debate. What do you think? Should we be able to clone individuals? Should we be able to clone animals, humans, both, only one? Let me know in the comments what you think. But then, besides these ethical debates, we will also be looking at the issues of consent as well. And this is an area which, again, the law is arguably very, very harsh, with a very strict approach to the consent requirements in the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Acts. But the courts have given a bit of flexibility as well, which is something we will discuss when we will get there. And this is also an area where I'm currently looking at doing some research about the consent requirements in assisted reproduction. And we will also, as I previously mentioned, have a rather large focus on surrogacy in this area, the process for surrogacy, the value of surrogacy, and the various limitations to surrogacy arrangements, as well as looking at possible reforms of the law around surrogacy. Then once we've done assisted reproduction, we then go on to abortion, where we will look at how abortion is prima facie unlawful. On the face of it, abortion is a criminal offence, and prosecutions for abortion do continue to still go ahead. But then we will look at the various exceptions. So there are 4 different situations where an abortion may be legal, providing the correct formalities are followed. For instance, that at least 2 doctors agree that a particular ground applies, the time limits, and if they're actually relevant anymore. And once we've looked at the law, we will look at actually the rights of the medical profession. Are medical individuals, medical practitioners, allowed to refuse to provide abortion services due to their religious beliefs, for instance? And then we will also look in parents' rights to abortion, i.e. the mother, what are her rights, as well as the fetus. Does the fetus have any rights? How is the fetus protected? Is the fetus even protected? But anyway, after that, we then go on to the last 2 areas of this topic of medical law. And these 2 topics are both linked, and they are both end of life. And so, in the first half of these topics, we look at euthanasia and assisted dying or suicide. As to essentially, should the law be allowing assisted suicide or not? We'll be looking at the assisted dying bill, which is currently going through Parliament. We'll look at some of the various debates around this topic, and also generally see how the law regulates this area. But from the case law, this is essentially unlawful to assist someone to die, and there's been many, many cases where individuals have wanted help to die because they can't do it themselves, and they haven't been able to, sadly. And then once we've done that, the second part of the end of life areas is about ending life support. And so this is essentially, when can we stop a machine from extending someone's life? And we'll look at the law around those areas. But that's essentially a glance at the kind of topics I intend to cover on this podcast over the coming weeks and months. And so I'm really quite excited to be covering these areas, and I hope you're as excited to listen to them. They are some very interesting areas, and so they're definitely areas you wouldn't want to miss. But on that topic, that will conclude this episode. So please do make sure you are following this podcast so you don't miss any of my future episodes. And also please do take a look at my YouTube channel, Law with Charlie, and please do like, comment and subscribe. It motivates me to continue to do this. It shows me there's a demand, and also I love your comments. When I get comments, it's just great to interact with my audience. So please do ask me any questions or just comment to say hello. But I think that's everything for now, so I wish you a good rest of your week, and I look forward to speaking to you again very, very soon on our next podcast. Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to Law with Charlie, with your host, Charlie Medcalf. Please do ensure that you leave a comment below either to just say hello or ask a question. And please like, subscribe, and leave a review for more content like this. See you next time.